The fantasy playoffs are here, and they kick off tomorrow night with the New England Patriots at the Los Angeles Rams on Thursday Night Football. But here's the top 30 running backs ranked here going into Week 14 in the first week of the playoffs. Number 1, Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. Last week, Henry, he didn't have a good game at all, man. But the thing was, his team was down 4 touchdowns early in the game to Cleveland. But this week, I think they're going to be up in this game early and often. And I could see Henry have a huge game here where he could go for 35, 40 fantasy points. Jacksonville gives up the third most fantasy points to running backs. I just see Henry having a field day. They're going to feed the big man here. They need this game as Tennessee after getting embarrassed last week, even though they cut it to a close game at the end. They need the win. They're going to feed the big man 25, 30 carries, and I think he's going to have a monster game like he did a few weeks ago versus Indianapolis. So I got Henry at number 1. Number 2, Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings. Dalvin Cook, another great game last week, finding the end zone and 100 yards total for Cook. Cook, he's getting more catches as well, it seems like, the last few weeks. And this guy, he's good anywhere from 25 to 30 fantasy points each and every week. This week, he's got a pretty tough matchup versus Tampa Bay that gives up the 27th least amount of fantasy points to running backs. So right here, Cook, it's going to be a tough matchup, but this guy is the engine to the offense, and he's going to get all these touches. You know, he's going to touch the ball anywhere from 25 to 30 times in running and receiving. And Cook, he's a certified beast, and he's a guy, I wouldn't be surprised if he has a breakout game too versus Tampa. So Dalvin Cook, number 2. Number 3, Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers. It's been the Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers show, but last week Jones, he broke off a 77-yard run versus Philly to put that ball game away, and it was good to see Jones break that one out. He had about 150 yards total in that game, was Jones, and this week he's got an amazing matchup versus the Detroit Lions that give up the most fantasy points to running backs. So this game, it's in Detroit, which is another good thing. They don't got to deal with the cold weather or the hard surface of the field. And Jones, I think he could have a field day over there versus the Detroit Lions. And the Lions, we saw David Montgomery gash him up last week. I think we could see the same from Aaron Jones here, and it wouldn't surprise me if he even is the top performer of the week. Number 4, Christian McCaffrey. The Carolina Panthers, it's been an injury-riddled season for McCaffrey, but now the Panthers coming off the bye week, it looks like McCaffrey's good to go in this ball game versus the Denver Broncos at home. When McCaffrey played this season, he's had some monster games where he was getting 35, 40 fantasy points, doing his usual role, catching 8 to 10 passes, rushing 20, 25 times. So McCaffrey, he's like 70% of this offense. And now with DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel on the list, McCaffrey, his touches can go up even more, I believe, in this ball game. So Christian McCaffrey, if he plays, which he should, he's easily number 4 here versus the Denver Broncos. Number 5, Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. It was good to see Kamara have a good ball game last week after he was struggling the last few weeks. But versus Atlanta, he did a little bit of everything. He caught some passes. He was running good. Latavius Murray, he didn't get really the workload. And this week versus Philly, it's another good matchup. Even though Philly gives up the 10th least amount of fantasy points to running backs, Kamara, he's still a top 5 option each and every week for me. And this week, Taysom Hill's most likely going to start one more week. They're 3-0 with him behind at center. So there's no reason in my mind to rush Drew Brees back. I know the Saints are fighting for that number 1 seed here in the NFC. But Hill's running it well with this offense. And Kamara, I think he has a good game here. And this Philly defense, they really can't stop anyone. Just like I mentioned before, we saw Aaron Jones break a 77-yard run. So I wouldn't be surprised if Kamara breaks a big one as well and could get 150 total yards in this game. The next one's James Robinson at number 6 versus the Tennessee Titans. James Robinson, what a season for this undrafted rookie coming out of nowhere. And last week, another great game for him versus the Minnesota Vikings was Robinson. This guy, he's a dual threat. He does it all. He plays just about every snap for this Jacksonville Jaguar team. And pretty much he's the only bright spot, which has been a horrible season for this Jaguar team and offense. So James Robinson, he's a guy, I say it each and every week. He'll get you anywhere from 15 to 30 fantasy points, and that's a great ceiling and a good floor to get anywhere from that. So Robinson versus Tennessee, that gives up the 6 most fantasy points to running backs. I could see another great game for Robinson. I think Glennon's going to start again here, so they're going to rely on him more, and he's a good start. Number 7, Chris Carson of the Seattle Seahawks. It was good to see Carson last week have a good fantasy day with 20 fantasy points, and he even caught a wheel route out of the backfield versus the Giants for a touchdown. This game versus the Jets, they're going to have to run this guy more after coming off that bad loss last week. Seattle, I think they took the Jets easy. They should have the Giants easy. They should have ran the ball more. And this week versus the Giants, they should run the ball more and feed the beast here. And Chris Carson, he's looked healthy. He scored 2 touchdowns now in the last 2 games since he returned from the foot injury. And it wouldn't surprise me to see Carson rack up anywhere from 120 to 150 total yards and 1 or 2 touchdowns in this game. This is one of the best matchups you could ask for on any week, and to have him here in the first week of the playoffs, this is a big start here. Number 8, Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. Nick Chubb, he's been an absolute monster since he came off his injury with 300-yard games in a row. This week, though, it's going to be a tough matchup versus Baltimore. It's a Monday Night Football game. It's a big divisional game. This is like a playoff game in its own here versus Cleveland versus Baltimore. Nick Chubb, he's still going to do his thing. This is a guy you got to start each and every week. I got him 8th here because of the matchup, and these other guys, they got plus matchups, and they're top 10 backs to start with. But Nick Chubb, in my rest of season rankings at running back, he's ranked number 3rd, so check that video out. But anyway, Nick Chubb, he's going to have a good game, I think. He's not going to maybe crack the 100 yards, but I could see him get 80 yards and a touchdown, and that's still solid here for Nick Chubb. Number 9, Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers. Ekeler, a few weeks ago, he came back with a huge ball game, but last week versus New England, just nothing was working for this Charger team. So Ekeler, he had a down game, but this week he's going to have a great matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons, and we'll see if this Charger offense could bounce back. I don't know if they could. The last 2 weeks, they've just looked down, but Austin Ekeler, he's a dual threat. He could do a little bit of everything, and I think this game versus Atlanta, it will be a shootout and pretty close. I think Ekeler, he could get 20, 25 fantasy points, especially in PPR leagues, and I think he's a safe guy here at number 9. Number 10, DAndre Swift of the Detroit Lions. It's been a rough few weeks for Swift. First he had a concussion, then he had an illness, not COVID-related, last week, but he hasn't been on the field now in the last 3 games for Detroit. Detroit could really use him, and this is an amazing matchup versus the Green Bay Packers that give up the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs. You know, Detroit is still in the hunt a little here, and Swift, to get him back will be nice, but Adrian Peterson, he's been holding up his own, and Peterson, we saw him rush for 2 touchdowns last week. But this Detroit offense could definitely use Swift. And if Swift plays, he's a top 10 option this week. With the matchup along and all the volume he's going to get and the dual threat that he causes is Swift out of the backfield. This guy's got the great matchup. And like I said, he's number 10. Number 11, Miles Sanders of the Philadelphia Eagles. It's a tough matchup versus New Orleans. They give up the least amount of fantasy points to running backs. And we saw it once again last week where they shut down Todd Gurley. He pretty much didn't do anything in that ball game. But Sanders here, I think he can rely on him more now with Jalen Hurts as the starter over there in Philly. And Philly, honestly, they got to set the tone here running the ball. Sanders, he's been a disappointment for the most part since he came back from his injury a few weeks ago versus the Giants. But Sanders this week, I think he's going to get a big workload, like I said, with Hurts out there. Hurts, he's more mobile than Carson Wentz. And maybe a lot of checkdowns we could see to Sanders in this ball game. So I got Sanders at 11. Number 12, David Montgomery of the Chicago Bears. He's got a good matchup versus the Houston Texans this week is Montgomery. We saw Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines have good ball games last week was versus that in Houston. I think Montgomery, for another week in a row, he's going to have a good matchup. He's been running the ball way better, especially since Mitch Trubisky got back in the starting lineup. It opens the field up for the Bears offense, and Montgomery, he's going to get the full workload pretty much, even though we did see Cordell Patterson last week get 10 carries, but I just think that was game flow as well in the way. So Montgomery this week, he's number 12. He's got a good matchup. He's getting the volume, and he's been producing. Number 13, Josh Jacobs, if he plays, versus the Indianapolis Colts. And Jacobs here, he's an up-and-down guy. We saw Devonta Booker fill in for him versus the New York Jets last week, and he was pretty bad, was Booker, so he's not going to be a threat if Jacobs comes back. Jacobs, he has monster games when he gets the workload. The only knock on Jacobs is he can be inconsistent at times, and he don't catch the ball out of the backfield. But I still like his matchup for a decent fantasy game versus Indianapolis, because we saw last week David Johnson, he had a good ball game versus Indy, and I think Jacobs could put up similar numbers. Number 14, Antonio Gibson of the Washington football team, another guy banged up with injury. We saw him leave that game immediately versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, was Gibson, but now we'll see what he could do this week if he plays at San Francisco. That's a tough matchup, and that's why I got him number 14 here. But last week they beat the Steelers. What a game it was without Gibson. But if he comes back, he's obviously going to get the full workload, and McKissic will work on third downs. But Gibson, hopefully he could play with that toe and ankle injury this week at San Francisco. Number 15, Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. He looked pretty decent versus the Baltimore Ravens last night in a tough game with Dallas. 4 out of their 5 offensive linemen who started the season as starters are injured or out for the season. So Elliott, he looked a little pep in his step. He had about 15 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And this week versus Cincinnati, it's a pretty good matchup. We just saw running backs go off versus Cincinnati. We saw Gaskin have a good game. We saw a few weeks ago Wayne Gorman have a good game versus them. So I think Elliott, he could have a decent game, 70, 80 total yards and a touchdown here versus Cincinnati. But he also could go the other way where he don't do much. But at 15, I think it's a safe spot. Number 16, Todd Gurley of the Atlanta Falcons. I don't know if Gurley's even going to play this game, because last game he was in out of the lineup once again with the knee. His explosiveness pretty much looked gone, and Gurley just kept holding that knee. But this week he's got a good matchup versus the Chargers. At least it's another dome game, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to running back. So maybe Gurley could get something going and get back to what he was doing. But like I've been saying for weeks, Gurley's touchdown dependent, and when he don't get the touchdown, he's only getting 5 or 6 fantasy points at most. But he's number 16. Number 17, Clyde EdwardsHelaire. Last week he was active, but he didn't get one carry in that ball game on Sunday Night Football versus the Denver Broncos, which was puzzling. He was probably just there for an emergency. But anyway, Clyde EdwardsHelaire, people who've had him in their lineup, they could have lost their games because they got the 0 from him. But this week versus Miami, he's going to get action, I think. He's going to get his basic workload, I think. Maybe Bell will lead into it a little. Bell looked decent, not that great in her last spot last week. But versus Miami, it's a tough matchup. They give up the 10th least amount of fantasy points to running back. So we'll see what CEH could do. So he's number 17. Number 18, Wayne Gorman of the New York Giants. We saw Gorman have a huge run versus the Seattle Seahawks for 60 yards, but Alfred Morris in this ball game, he vultured him twice. But Wayne Gorman, man, this guy, he's been putting up double-digit fantasy points now since Freeman got hurt in week 6 or 7, I believe it was, versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And even if Freeman comes back, even though now he's on the COVID list as well with the ankle injury, this is Gorman's backfield. I don't know how the Giants can bench this guy, especially they're on a winning streak. So Wayne Gorman, it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus Arizona. But he's a guy, he's getting the volume, 15, 20 touches a game. I know he's not getting many receiving yards, but he's obviously the goal line back there, except last week it was a little fluky. He needed rest after that long run. But Gorman, he's a guy I'm going to start each and every week pretty much on my number 2 running back or flex, unless his stats and his touches drop off. Number 19, J.K. Dobbins. We saw him have a good ball game versus Dallas, but once again, he only had 10 or 11 touches in that game, and he finished with 75 yards and a touchdown. And J.K. Dobbins, this is a guy, they got to give him the full workload over there. Mark Ingram looks washed. Gus Edwards, he's good for a change of pace back for a few carries, but this guy Dobbins, like Swift, I've been saying for weeks, until Swift got the job, he needs 15 or 20 touches at least as Dobbins. He's explosive. He's got the most juice back there in that backfield for Baltimore. And when he gets going, this guy, he can burst big away runs. and he's got a crazy like 6 or 7 yards per carry in most of his games this season. So J.K. Dobbins, the only reason he's 19 here, because I don't know the workload he's going to get, and it's a pretty tough matchup at Cleveland. Number 20, David Johnson of the Houston Texans. It was good to see Johnson come back last week versus the Colts, and he looked good, and he had a touchdown. And now this week he's got a tough matchup versus the Chicago Bears. They're pretty stout versus the run, but this guy, he's getting the carries. Duke Johnson, he'll get a couple passes here and there, but Johnson, he's going to get 15, 20 touches in this ball game. And the Texans, they're out of it, but they're still going to play these guys. And like I've been saying, Johnson, he has to play. They traded DeAndre Hopkins to get him, so they got to make it look a little decent on this side end of the trade. So Johnson, he'll get touches. He's a number 2 to flex this week, even with the tough matchup. So he's number 20. Number 21, Myles Gaskin of the Miami Dolphins. It was good to see Gaskin come back last week after missing multiple weeks with the injury, and he had a good game versus Cincinnati. This week, a tougher matchup, though, versus Kansas City, but I could still see Gaskin getting, 12, 15 points maybe, especially this guy, he's a dual threat. He could catch 3 or 4 balls out of the backfield for this Dolphin offense, and honestly, when he was out, no one was really a threat to take the job over. Matt Breida, he didn't do anything. Washington, he didn't do nothing. And Salvin Ahmed, he had 1 or 2 good games. But now with the shoulder injury, he's been out now the last 2 weeks. So this is Gaskin's backfield. I got him at 21. Hopefully this game versus the Chiefs doesn't get out of hand where they're going to just have to throw the ball a ton. But Gaskin here, I still like him in this matchup versus Kansas City where he can have a decent ball game. Number 22, Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. It was good to see Taylor come back after he was on the COVID list last week, and he had a good ball game, was Taylor. He broke away a big touchdown for 55 yards to catapult the Colts to take the lead versus Houston. And now this week, he's got a great matchup at the Vegas Raiders, who give up the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. I can see Taylor have a good game here. They're going to give him the carries. Jordan Wilkins, he's not a threat. Nyheim Hines, like I said, he's built in as their 3rd down back and passing downs back when it's long and distance. But Taylor, he's still going to get 12 to 18 carries, I believe, or touches in this game. And to see him break one out last week, it shows confidence they still have in him over there in Indianapolis. And he's a good number 2 this week, especially with the matchup versus Vegas. Number 23, Melvin Gordon. He's got the Carolina Panthers coming up. And last week, Melvin Gordon, he looked quick. He looked spry. He made some good cutbacks and plays versus Kansas City in a game that was pretty close for most of the night. So Melvin Gordon this week at Carolina, they give up the 7th most fantasy points to running backs. And Gordon, he's another guy, though. He's very inconsistent. He could have a huge week and then a bad week. But this week, I think he's decent as a flex option here in the playoffs. And like I said, he's got a good matchup, Carolina. This game, though, I could see Carolina blowing them out, or I could see it being close. So we don't know what Denver team's going to show up this week. But Gordon, he's getting the carries. He's getting work. Phillip Lindsay, he's just a change of pace back, it looks like now, the last few weeks. So Gordon, I got at 23. Number 24, Nyheim Hines of the Indianapolis Colts. Hines, he's been solid the last few weeks, and he's been playing more in this Colts offense. And now he's got a good matchup versus the Vegas Raiders in a game that I could see being a shootout for the most part. And the Colts, they get in a lot of shootouts, it seems like, the last few weeks. And Hines, he's got double-digit fantasy points now in his last 3 out of 4 games. And now the great matchup versus the Raiders. He's going to get a 5 to 8 carries on the ground. And, he's going to get work out of the backfield. And we've even seen Hines get a couple goal line touches as well over the last few weeks. So at 24, I think he's a number 2 to a flex running back starter. Number 25, Raheem Mostert of the San Francisco 49ers. Mostert, last week versus Buffalo, he just didn't get much work. Jeffrey Wilson Jr. was in there a lot. But this week, he's got a pretty decent and tough matchup, if you want to say, versus Washington football team. But we saw last week they shut down the Steelers running game. But Mostert, I think he's more talented than Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland at this point. But Mostert, if they're down early and often, I think they're going to preserve him in San Francisco, because we saw that a lot versus Buffalo. Once the game was 2 or 3 possessions they were down, Mostert wasn't in there it was all Jeffrey Wilson Jr. and Coleman. But Mostert, if it's a close game, he's going to get 12 to 15 touches. And this guy's got home run breakaway speed. So I could see him maybe break one in this game. At number 25, number 26, Ronald Jones of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Jones, he's been an inconsistent running back as well. It seems like each and every week, it's either him or Leonard Fournette splitting carries or getting more workload. Jones, his problem this year has been the fumbles. It's been his not catching the ball either out of the backfield. But when this guy, he don't make mistakes. He's a decent running back, but I just can't trust him, especially in the playoffs. I got him 26 here. If you got no other options, then you start him, because Minnesota, they're a pretty decent run defense as well. So Ronald Jones, he's a guy I'm on the fence about. He does crack the top 30 here, but he's a guy I can't trust. So if you've been benching him for a few weeks, bench him. If you've been riding him the last few weeks to get to the playoffs, just put him in there then. Number 27, Kenyan Drake of the Arizona Cardinals. He's got a tough matchup versus this Giant defense. All of a sudden now, that's one of the best front sevens in all of football. And Drake, he's been pretty solid the last few weeks. He's got double-digit fantasy points in the last 3 out of his 4 games. But this week, very tough matchup, like I said, versus the Giants. The Giants, they're going everywhere. They're flying around the ball, and they're making plays. And even at 5-7, this Giant team, they got life now. And they're trying to win the division between them and the Washington football team. And with Arizona making that cross-country flight, it's going to be a tough game for Arizona to get up for this. And usually when we see teams fly cross-country, they struggle or get off to slow starts. So in this game, I could see the Giants totally bottle up Drake and not see him do much in this one. Number 28, Gio Bernard of the Cincinnati Bengals. It's been a tough few weeks for Gio Bernard, but Joe Mixon, I believe, will be out again here this week versus the Dallas Cowboys. And Bernard, he cracks this list because of his matchup versus Dallas, who gives up the 8th most fantasy points to running backs. And Bernard, he hasn't cracked double digits now since week 8. So I think in this game, he's got a shot to do it. We saw what the Ravens did on the ground last night versus the Cowboys, running the ball for, I think, about 230 yards in that game. So Gio Bernard, I think he could break loose and find the end zone in this one possibly. But I'm not going to rank him up there because I don't know what he's going to do, and he's been struggling the last few weeks. Number 29, Kareem Hunt of the Cleveland Browns. Hunt, he's been struggling the last few weeks as well, but this is a run-first team, obviously, over there in Cleveland. He's still going to get 12 to 15 touches, but he hasn't cracked double-digit fantasy points now since week 10 is Hunt, and he's got a tough matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens that give up the 9th least amount of fantasy points to running backs. So Hunt, like I said, Chubb's the man there. It's a tough matchup, and he's a guy you could still use as a flex or a number 2, but he's a guy I'm not going to have that much confidence in. And number 30 is J.D. McKissic of the Washington football team. We saw McKissic come in and really put a lot of work in versus that Pittsburgh Steelers defense with 10 catches, 70 yards off the bench after Antonio Gibson left the game last week versus the Steelers. So if Gibson don't play, McKissic, he's going to crack my top 15. But on this list, I got Gibson playing as of now. So McKissic, he's going to be down here in the lower ranks. This game, it's going to be I think they're going to win this game versus San Francisco. But I could see it being close too, where they're not going to have McKissic in there as many snaps. So if Antonio Gibson don't play, McKissic bumps up, and Peyton Barber would get the goal line and the short yardage work. This guy left off the list, James Conner. If he does play, we don't know if he's coming off the COVID list. He'd be the number 12 running back in my rankings this week, but we just don't know what Conner, if he's going to play. He's still got a pretty tough matchup versus the Buffalo Bills that give up the 11th least amount of fantasy points to running backs. But Conner, he would be in my top 12 at number 12 if he plays this week. So that's the top 30 running backs I'm ranking here heading into week 14.